Hey everyone, thank you for coming for this very, very important stream. So, listen, as you know, last Friday I uploaded this video critiquing Dennis McDonald, his idea that the Gospels are imitating Homer, and I was really happy with that video. But then that evening, a scholar contacted me and he says, "I think I can convince you of mimesis." So I said, "Yeah, sure, okay." So I was like, "I don't know about this." But I decided I would give him a chat. I'd talk to him, figure this stuff out. And, I was going to say, like, we'll take a look at some of this mimesis stuff, but I'm not entirely sure and convince me. Well, I don't know. He started showing me some very interesting stuff here. So I was kind of blown away at first. But he was like, listen, you can't just be thinking of the Gospels. You really got to take mimesis further here. You gotta look at some other areas. And then when he started showing me some of these examples, I was immediately blown away. I was like, man, there's actually something here. So I thought we talked for hours, and I was like, I should just bring him on, uh, and just let you guys talk to him and hear what he actually has to say, because there's some actual very interesting stuff here. So sorry about the connection right now. It should catch up here in a minute. For some reason, it's coming in a little weird. We'll see if we can get that fixed. Yeah, the video quality is low. I get you guys in the chat. Not sure why that's happening here. Could be something with my internet. Let me see if I can see if we can get that fixed for you. But I mean, like, talking back about mimesis here, like he actually kind of convinced me of certain things. So I thought, you know what? Let me just bring him on. We'll talk to him and you can see for yourself, because he really sort of actually presented some interesting stuff. And so let me just bring him in here. His name is a little interesting. His name is Dr. Is very similar to Dr. Donald McDennis. Dr. Dennis McDonald, but he's a little different, and he doesn't think Dr. McDonald goes too far. So let me just bring him in here. So can you hear me, Dr. Donald McDennis? Are you there?
Oh, yes, I can hear you, Michael. Thank you for having me as a guest on your show. This is a very, very delightful opportunity and a very wonderful insight from Charleston, South Carolina.
Yes, yes. And so as I was telling the audience, you had contacted me and you were like, "Hey, I think I can convince you of this mimesis, but stop looking at the Gospels." You're a huge fan of Dr. Dennis McDonald. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah, he is without a doubt my favorite scholar on the subject. But the thing is, Michael, I don't think he goes far enough with his.
Right.
He's so brilliant, he shortcuts himself here. And I think we actually need to take his methodology and bring it to a greater understanding than his own brilliant mind can handle.
And that's what really got me interested here, is because you've taken his methodology and you've applied it to other areas of history, and you've shown that everyone was doing mimesis, imitation. And when you realize that, it's not hard to believe the Gospels were doing it too, because you just take McDonald's own methodology, his own criteria, and you apply it elsewhere, and you get astounding results. Is that correct?
That is absolutely right, Michael. In fact, as a Southerner, we love to talk about the Civil War. And I started thinking, I was sitting on the front porch with my wife, Hilda, the other week, and we were talking about the Civil War. And one of the things that brought some ideas to mind is there's a lot of mimesis in the Civil War compared to the Odyssey. Right, and it opened a whole new world for me.
Yeah. So that's very interesting. So let me pull up 1 second here. So talk a little bit more about that. And so you when we started going into this, I was like, I'm not so sure about that. But real quick, I'm gonna just try to fix my internet here 1 second.
Yes, you were absolutely right. You are a skeptic by design, Michael, whether you believe that or not. But the thing is when we got into the discussion, the more I started showing you the methodology, you quickly got excited about the information I was sharing. And for that, I think we need to actually get into every single parallel, every single one.
Right. And I think that's what we're going to do here. So let's pull up some slides here. Let me make sure you guys can see them. So can you see that on the screen there? Let me make sure that's coming up.
Ah, yes, I can see it on my end. Thank you, Michael. If you don't mind, go ahead and explain to the audience the overall beginnings, and I'll jump right in and share my discoveries.
Excellent. So yeah, so you have taken Nick McDonald's own criteria, these ideas about that he uses to show the Gospels are mimesis. So accessibility, was Homer accessible to the authors? Yes, it was for the Gospel authors. Did other authors imitate Homer? Yes, they did. Are there more parallels present? Yes, absolutely. Is the sequences of events relatively similar? And you showed me some very interesting examples where that does happen. Are there any distinctive traits? And yes, we did find those. Is anything gained by imitation? Like show Jesus is superior? Yes. Same thing in the example we're going to cover here today. And did other authors around the same time show awareness between Homer and the account? You are also able to fulfill that. So this is what we're going to get into, ladies and gentlemen. The Iliad, we can say, is imitated throughout the years. It's even been imitated here in America to create the American Iliad, aka the Civil War. Now, you're from the South. You know all the different conspiracy theories. That's what they call them in the North. You guys don't call them conspiracy theories in the South. But there's a lot of different theories about really happened in the Civil War. Is that accurate?
Oh, Michael, the Civil War started in Charleston, right in my backyard. I mean, we absolutely know about that. There is no conspiracies if you are looking for facts. And the thing is, there are facts found all in the things we're talking about. I think the Northern Invasion, which is the more proper terminology for the war,
well, just
Northern Invasion. Excuse me, I get excited at some of this discussion. The Northern Invasion is simply trying to show power over us to this day. But really, I found the secret, Michael. There is a connection to the Odyssey and Homer. I really
and
believe
the Iliad
that.
you mentioned. You mentioned the Iliad and the Odyssey.
We will get to the Iliad in no time. In fact, I think the Iliad speaks for itself, but I don't want to jump ahead of myself, Michael.
Right. So there are specific characters that this now real quick before we get into it, you're not a mythicist. Like you don't believe the Civil War is a total myth, right?
No, I think obviously it was a war. I see the evidence of the war everywhere around me. That's not the point at all. I just think that there's more to the story than that meets the eye.
Exactly. There's layers of myth here that has been added by Northern propaganda to prop this up as some big war, to keep the South down, to pretend like they made this massive victory, turned it into something far more mythical than it ever was. And we're going to expose some of that today, because what they use as their template is they were imitating the Iliad and the Odyssey to give the people their own Iliad, their own American Iliad. Is that what you would say?
I think that is very accurate, Michael. Very accurate.
Great. Let's start getting into the first character. So the most famous character of Homer is none other than Odysseus. Who on earth could be Odysseus in the American Iliad?
Well, like I was saying, Michael, I was sitting on the front porch with Hilda, and she asked me a question about a general that we will unfortunately have to talk about, despite all of our hatred for him. But she asked me, she said, is Ulysses S. Grant's name transliterated Odysseus? And I was like, actually, it is.
That's right.
It he's translated or transliterated Odysseus. So Ulysses S. Grant's name is already in the Odyssey.
Yeah, I found that. I was like, oh, yeah, that's right. Because if you read like the Latin versions, they call him Ulysses in the Iliad and in the Odyssey when they're using like the Roman names. But also you pointed something else out about this interesting is that the last name, Ulysses S. Grant's last name is Grant. Now, what does Grant mean? Is that it means big, or it sounds a little like grand. So notice what they're doing here. This is not just Odysseus. This is the big Odysseus of the American Iliad and Odyssey. This is one of McDonald's criterion we talked about, is that they want to show a much better version of these characters. The Iliad and the Odyssey has Odysseus, but America and the American Iliad has the big Odysseus, the grand Odysseus, which I thought was
That
very
is
interesting here.
that is 100. And I'm so glad you're a good listener, Michael, because the thing that I said on that is this: there is more that meets the eye, and his first and last name can all be found. This is mimesis.
Yes, and it's not just that. You've found so many parallels here. So let's start going through these. So
We're
I'll
just
go through
getting
them.
started.
We have so many here. Guys, your mind is going to be blown away when you realize who Achilles is. I couldn't believe it, but he's right there in the American Iliad. You just got to look for him, and you got to realize how clever these myth makers were here. So let's get into this. What other things do we know about Odysseus and Ulysses that we find parallels here?
Well, if you remember your history very well, you would know that Odysseus tried to avoid going to war. Now, if you remember, Grant is supposedly some sort of hero who willingly signed up to go to war for his nation's greater good, of course. But did you notice they both had to make a decision about war, and both made a choice? There is a connection. But again, we have to take this thing and a massive, huge, accumulative case.
Right. So this is a transvaluation, what you and Dr. McDonald talk about. Is that correct?
That's 100 correct. That's 100%.
Yes. So let's keep going on here. What else is going on here? So now you noticed you've met. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, as you know the story, Grant was not at all very religious, and nor was Odysseus for that matter. Neither one of them was religious. In fact, Grant was a drunk. He did not care about the things of God like most people at his time. The same is true of Odysseus.
Yeah, some people even speculated Ulysses as Grant, the guy behind all these legends, may have even been agnostic, which I found was very interesting there. And you said this is a very interesting point that we'll use when we come back to Hector, because there's a contrast here with Hector in the American Iliad. Yeah, so let's keep going here. So what else?
Okay, well, obviously Odysseus inspired his men to keep fighting. Now, remember when Grant came on the scene, he had to inspire the North because they were actually losing the war, thank God. And at that time, as they were losing the war, and unfortunately, Grant's motivational power of speech moved his men to fight and eventually, unfortunately, won the whole war. But nonetheless, inspiration was a big part of both of these men's schemes.
Right. So what else do we have here, though? You've got a couple more listed here. Yes.
Well, I don't think anybody would deny, in some sense, the brilliance of both. Both are brilliant warriors. He won the Trojan War by intelligence, and obviously the American Civil War was won by the intelligence of the general himself.
Yes. What else?
Oh, my. Okay. Well, obviously, if you look at the casualties, the numbers are innumerable in many, many senses. So many soldiers died under both commands, you see. And at this, they both laid siege to places. If you look at the siege of Troy, the most notorious, the most famous. Also, when you look at Grant, he laid siege to two major. Petersburg and Vicksburg are major ones that we talk about. We don't like talking about them, by the way. But they do exist in history by laying siege. Did you catch that, folks? Siege was taken.
Yeah. And if you notice, like it's the grand Odysseus lays siege to multiple cities, whereas just Odysseus laid siege to Troy. And so he's laying siege to multiple cities to show he's a much better Odysseus. And also Petersburg is the very important siege because this is right outside of Richmond, the capital of the South. And so he lays siege to that at the very end of the war, and then ultimately leads to victory. Very similar to the Achaeans laying siege to Troy here. So,
but don't forget what happened, Michael. But don't forget what happened. Troy is burned, and Odysseus is present at the burning, just as Grant was present when Richmond was burned.
That's a good point. Yeah, and that's another one you list here. Very interesting here. What else do we have?
Okay, well, the Trojan horse behind enemy lines with Odysseus's men, we see that even
Mm,
major art is shown demonstrating such a
mm,
thing. But we see the same thing. General Sherman's army and his cavalry, that God-forsaken people, they came behind General Lee. I mean, there was major surrounding points that take place here. We have to remember there's a surrounding, and there seems to be a cavalry of some sort in both stories. Is that a coincidence? I think not, Michael.
that's true. And also, this one blew me away. This next one, because you remember in the Odyssey, Odysseus's men disguised as sheep. Now Sherman,
Ah,
Sherman is Ulysses S. Grant's right-hand man. What does
oh
Sherman
yes.
mean? Shearer
Oh,
of woolen garments. Look at how they're making this a far better Odysseus. His men aren't just disguised as sheep. His men are shearers of sheep. Notice the difference. Notice how his men are just far better, because this is a much better Odysseus. And the idea of Odysseus sending the Trojan horse into Troy. This is obviously a transfer or an imitation in what Ulysses S. Grant is doing by sending Sherman down to Atlanta behind enemy lines to surround the South. It's a very similar thing, but of course it can't be the same, guys. It's mimesis. They have to make changes. There's going to be similarities, and you would expect differences. That's the point. Is that correct?
oh, that is the point. Not only is that the point, that is mimesis, which is the greater here. Now, listen, I wish that was all there was, but we're just getting warmed up.
There's so much more
Look,
here. Yes.
oh man, yes, he served under Agamemnon, if you remember, Odysseus did,
Mm-hmm.
and guess who? Obviously, Grant served under a higher power as well, Abraham Lincoln himself. God rest
Right.
his soul, so we say. And then he also under this. Did you know that he was actually younger than Agamemnon, just as Grant was younger than Abraham Lincoln?
No, I did not know that, but it's an interesting.
Look it up,
there.
folks. It's in
And
your
what's
history books.
And what's also interesting is in the Iliad, Achilles is younger than both of them, and you'll be surprised at who Achilles is. I'm telling you, that one blew me away. We'll get to that in a little bit here, but continue on, Dr. McDennis.
Oh, it's not over yet. In fact, both of them were married men, if you remember the stories well. In
Mhm.
fact, Odysseus had a loyal wife, despite him being away from home in war and fighting and politics, for goodness sakes. And on the other hand, it's told in history that the same can be said about Grant. And now, the interesting thing is that Odysseus, on the other hand, he was actually very unfaithful.
Mhm.
Now, it is said, on the other hand, that Grant was very faithful to his wife. We joke in the South and say only when he was sober. But at the end of the day, there is the parallel between the wives, and I don't think that should be missed, Michael.
Right. It's a transvaluation there. And this is, Northern myths about this legendary hero. The American grand or big Odysseus has to be a good American boy who's going to be faithful to his wife. That's why that has to be transformed. That has to be transvaluation there. That's a very important point. Yes.
Oh, yes, and then there's more here. Obviously, Odysseus sailed a fleet of ships across the Mediterranean Sea. Most people don't know this, actually, about our friend Grant here. He sailed a fleet of ships down the Mississippi River. Most people had no idea that he was actually working with the Navy. Yes, I think this is where you got excited, actually.
That's when I got excited, because I'm like, of all the people in the Civil War that are sailing ships down the Mississippi, it has to be the one named Odysseus. I was like, they're putting it right in our faces. They're not even trying to hide it. This is clearly meant to be imitation of Odysseus. I mean, of all the generals to put on the Mississippi going after Vicksburg with this fleet of ships, it's the one named Odysseus. Mind blown there.
But after it all said and done, when we look at this, Odysseus also returned home and defeated corrupt suitors. Now, when Grant came home, he won the White House. In fact, remember, Andrew Johnson, one of the worst ever, Andrew Johnson comes in and he actually removes him, defeats, and he ends up taking the White House himself. So we even see the succession of this comes in a timely manner for both.
Right. Yeah, they both One of them goes home. One of them goes to the White House. Again, there's that imitation thing, though. Removing corrupt people. What else do we have here, though, which is interesting?
Oh, this is one that I think most Americans will find interesting, especially those in the South. Here in Charleston, we talk about it all the time. So Odysseus freed his house from slavery to the suitors. Now, remember, one of the main motivational fights for the North and the South in this wretched war is that slavery ended under the leadership of Ulysses S. Grant, leading the way to victory.
Yes. So they both kind of, so you see Odysseus, he sort of frees his house from these suitors, but the grand Odysseus, he ends all of slavery. It's mind-boggling how much they're just making this a far better Odysseus. So interesting. What else?
Yes. Oh, well, remember, Odysseus became a ruler. And if you remember, anybody who knows our American presidents knows that, unfortunately, Grant became a president of the United States. I can't even believe they let that drunk man in, but they did. He was president of the United States. And if you remember, there were assassination attempts. Now, Odysseus removed himself. He's thwarted from it. And as the same was true for Grant, there was a grand conspiracy about killing presidents. Obviously, Lincoln was shot in the head, for goodness sakes. But Grant was actually attempted at assassination. I don't know if anybody knew that, but he survived as well. He thwarted it. He was no longer a victim.
Right. And this last one you mentioned is kind of like you're not sure about because you may be there, but the interesting one of this last one is there is this S in Ulysses S. Grant's name. Now, people think it refers to his middle name. It actually isn't. And when you explained this to me, I was like, oh, I never thought of that. According to the legends, it came from a clerical error when he signed up at West Point. But you have a much different idea. You think it might be associated with sea, maybe ships. Like this is the grand Odysseus of the sea, and that's what the S is for, which I was like, that's an interesting connection you have there.
Oh, yes. If your listeners would just look on the screen here, they will see all the S's that are associated. Some say there's a mistake in him signing his name. Oh, no. I don't think there's a mistake here at all, Michael. I think there is intentionality, and as I always say, mimesis.
Mimesis, correct. Yeah. And like, guys, it's just a story. Stop trying to rationalize it, okay? This is what they're doing. This is the grand or the big Odysseus of the sea here for the American Iliad. Now, like, again, we're not saying that Ulysses S. Grant is a myth, okay? We're not going that far. We're just saying, like, there's a lot of mythology that has been put in here by Northern propaganda, probably from the federal government here, to sort of make this war seem far more mythical than it was. Is that kind of what you're getting at? Or do I have you right there?
Oh, it's not kind of, Michael. It is entirely where I'm going with all this. And I wish we were at the end of this and say, that's it. No. Yeah. I think there's more to go.
Let me do that. Let's go to quick super chats here. So, is creation ex nihilo a late 2nd century concept? Well, the development of it, the formal language is it, but I mean, you can find it in earlier writings, Greek and Hebrew, is what I would say. So, it's kind of like with the Trinity, the word didn't come about till later, but you could clearly see concepts earlier. You see, Zeus is smiting your interconnection. This is the proof, yes, but we have overcome the power of Zeus here, so don't worry about that. It's my birthday. Thank you for the awesome videos. You're welcome. Scarlett, thank you. Hey, Michael, is it possible for us to obtain copies of the PowerPoints? Listen, we're going to put all the information below in a Google Doc that Dr. McDennis has been working on for a while. It'll all be linked below, so you will have it all. Trust me. Civil War was initially the most ambitious recreation of the Iliad, but it got out of hand. You're absolutely right. And you had said this to me over the weekend. Is that not true?
In fact, your listener here should be giving him $5. I mean, he's already catching on to this. Oh, this is exciting, Michael. This is what we wanted. We wanted the audience to see the truth.
That's right. Trex fan says truth nuke. You're absolutely right. Thank you so much, Fisherman's Corner, for gifting 50 Inspiring Philosophy memberships. Your super chats are always super generous. You also have to say, Walmart, no, sir. I redirect my channel earnings to outstanding channels. Love you all, guys. We love you too, sir. Thank you so much for supporting this channel. So we've already kind of hinted to it. Are you ready to get to the next character here?
More than ready. More than ready.
Yeah, this one, we kind of already hinted to it. So Agamemnon, okay, is obviously Abraham Lincoln. And you might be like, okay, how are you going to make this work? You're going to be blown away by these parallels here. So you ready to get into it, sir?
Oh, we're ready. We're ready. This is actually one of my favorite comparisons of mimesis. I don't know, but it doesn't take a genius to see that both names start with the letter A. Have you
Yeah, and
noticed that?
when I brought this up to you the weekend, I'm like, but the Iliad was written in Greek, sir. And you were like, Michael, you're wrong here because when they're doing mimesis in the 1800s in America, what are they reading? They're reading an English translation. Duh. I was like, oh, yeah, you're right. So they're going to be going off the English version. And in the English version, it's Agamemnon, starts with an A. Get
Yes,
it?
yes,
Totally.
yes. You have to think at the time of the Civil War. The Civil
Mm,
War was not reading Greek, they were reading English. Very good.
correct. So what else
Uh,
about Agamemnon do we have
So
here?
Agamemnon's name means very steadfast, and Abraham Lincoln was very steadfast facing the South, unfortunately. But
That's very true.
there was a steadfastness there. Now, each of them had 4 children.
Mm,
Now, most people may not know that, but you have to look at the details. Just do the fact checking, folks. I'm telling you, there are 4 children in each family. When Agamemnon went, he traveled west to siege Troy. Now, Lincoln traveled west to lead a war in Washington.
You know what's really interesting about that, sir, is most of the people at the time lived east. They lived in New England. They lived on the coast. Just so happens this guy's got to travel west. I mean, like, what are the odds when most people are on the East Coast? They would have had to travel, south or maybe a little bit north, perhaps. But traveling west, very unlikely. Not a lot of people were out that way. More Americans were in the north.
That's exactly right, Michael. In fact, what ended up happening next is that they both led large forces, not on a defensive attack, but rather an offensive attack. Now, remember, this is why we call it the War of Northern Invasion. In fact, Lincoln sent troops right here in Charleston, South Carolina, at Fort Sumter. We fired cannons on our own fort.
Yes, that's a good point. That's a very good point. And also, they both had very powerful navies that like surrounded the coast of their enemy. Like people don't realize in the Civil War, Lincoln surrounded the entire South with a naval blockade.
Oh,
Like,
yes,
how did he
yes.
have that many ships? I mean, it sounds like hearing about the Achaean ships in the Iliad.
It is exactly like that, Michael. In fact, you can go right down about 15 minutes from where I live. There is the Huntley. That was a submarine of the Civil War era that was taken down by Union ships and subs. There was a massive navy. In fact, we have relics of the war here in museums demonstrating this. Now, we know that there was a major host of ships at Agamemnon's possession, just as Lincoln did, and he won the war on shutting off access to our ships.
Now, people don't realize in the Iliad, they're the Achaeans, even though they have a major force, they're fighting for 10 years. They're being thwarted by this smaller force. What does that sound like to you, sir?
Well, it's what we've been talking about for the last 30 minutes now, isn't it? Now, listen, I want you to think about this. The coalition. Agamemnon led a coalition of different groups. One of the things that Lincoln wanted to do was preserve the states, the union of the states. It is a coalition that's going on here. So, yes. And Agamemnon represented unity just as Lincoln tried to preserve the Union, even though I would argue, of course, he went about it the wrong way. But invading the South is not the way to preserve Union. But that's for the historians to decide. I'm just here to talk about mimesis.
Right. And again, we're not saying all of the Civil War is myth. We're just saying there are layers of mythology here over the real historical stuff. Just like Dr. Dennis McDonald says he believes in a real historical Jesus, but there's just layers of myth in the gospel. Same kind of thing happening here. Is that correct?
Oh, yes. We're not denying reality. We're looking at it from the lens of there's one-ups here. People are trying to be better, a greater, actually. And I think the Civil War is pushing the envelope. It is pushing the agenda.
Right. So what else do we got here?
Oh, my. If you look at the leadership, for example. Agamemnon in his leadership was sometimes questioned because he was a very arrogant man. In fact, very bad choices in his life, I would say probably more often than not. And I would even say that Lincoln was criticized not only by the South, Michael, but by all of his friends and foes, even Northern congressmen and senators and people in the area did not like how Lincoln was very aggressive at times, but also unstable in his emotions. So there was a lot of questions of leadership.
Yes, yes. And, you can see that in the Iliad with Agamemnon being questioned by Achilles and other people as well. Like in the beginning, like they're already starting to question him. And so very interesting connection there. Yeah. What else do we have?
Well, they both lost children, unfortunately. Now, one of them was really his own fault. He sacrificed his daughter, Agamemnon did, for that matter.
Yes.
But most people don't know this, but one of the grieving decisions between Lincoln and his wife is that they lost a son, William, who died during the war. In fact, let me just say, this was part of the downfall in his marriage because she almost blamed Lincoln for their own son's death.
Yes, and this is, again, you can't have the American Iliad having someone sacrifice a child to a deity. So it's just transformed a little bit to make it more fit. I like what you did there. What else do we have?
Okay, yes. Now, if you look at this from the perspective of praying, Agamemnon prayed to the gods for victory, if you remember your history. And there's no doubt. We see portraits of Lincoln praying regularly. In fact, he issued a national proclamation that would call for prayer from all around that they would win war. And that's exactly, of course, they assert that God gave them victory, but they did pray, just as we see in the opponents over here.
Yes, that's
also to continue with that sacrifice. When we're looking at this thing, as I stated, he sacrificed his daughter, not just for fun, but he was trying to appease the gods in the story. Now, how many people did Lincoln sacrifice in order to win his war? His northern aggressive. Many people were killed for this. He sacrificed many a young men for this.
That's another interesting connection there. What else do we have?
Oh, man. Oh, yes. They faced discord. Both of them did. In fact, the Achaean ranks were very much on Agamemnon's tales of this, whereas Lincoln faced discord from the northern states. As I stated earlier, there was much discord amongst his own companions.
Yes, and I like that it happens during an election year, or the part of the Civil War has to happen. So, you're going to get then. It's like they kind of aligned it up very nicely. So, yeah, what else do we have here?
Now, if you'll remember in the story, Achilles disobeyed Agamemnon by refusing to fight in the Trojan War. Some people may not know that, but if you go back and read. And what we find as well is that northern generals actually were notorious for disobeying orders from Lincoln because they thought he was outside of his mind.
Yes, and there's a very important general we're going to get to in a little bit here. But before, let's continue on here. What else do we have?
Sure. Well, obviously, Agamemnon won the war because of his genius. And it's not because of just any genius. The genius we mentioned earlier, and that is Odysseus. Now, the same is true of Lincoln. It was our man, Ulysses S. Grant, who helped bring the genius to victory.
Yeah, interesting. What else do we have here? We have
well, we find Cassandra predicted his death, and then we find in Lincoln, and he had a dream of his death, and then voila, he's shot right in the head. And then we see the assassination was after the war. Don't miss that detail. The war had already ended when both were assassinated.
Yes, that's very, very interesting there. I like what you got there. And I want to, you asked me you said, listen, there are other authors that are recognizing this, but they're not going as far as you. So, but if you pull up some interesting stuff here. So, for example, where is it here? So let me just share this article. Notice what they're saying. The Odyssey of Ulysses S. Grant. They're recognizing there are similarities here between the Civil War and the Odyssey and the Iliad, but they're just not going so far as saying mimesis. This is another one of McDonald's interesting criteria being fulfilled. We're seeing other authors mention this kind of stuff. I also found this interesting book. The American Iliad. They're putting it in our faces. They're recognizing the Civil War has some eerie and striking similarities to the Iliad here. It's the American Iliad, as you've been saying, but they're just not willing to go as far as you. But they're recognizing there are similarities here, which I found really interesting here. This is another one of the criteria.
Just goes to show I'm not the only one who's thinking these things, Michael. It's not just me.
Yes, and I was thinking a little bit more about what some of the stuff you said. So, like, if you look at like Abraham Lincoln's vice president, his name is Hannibal Hamlin, and it's like, who is this guy? Why does he have this weird name, Hannibal? Well, Menelaus is Agamemnon's right-hand man, his brother. His name means wrath of the people. Hannibal was the wrath of the people of Carthage, and we know from the Aeneid they believed that the Romans were descendant of Trojan. So Menelaus is wrath of the people in the Iliad. Hannibal is later the wrath of the people of Carthage against Rome, allegedly the same people. Odd connection there that Abraham Lincoln's right-hand man is also named Hannibal. Interesting little parallel they're trying to hide in there like that.
That is right.
And so you want to get into who you think Hector is, because this was also very interesting.
You know, I originally had no intention of looking into Hector. However, when I read Hector, and then I was sitting there thinking, again, I was on the front porch with Hilda. We talk all the time about the Civil War. And one of the things that she mentioned as well was Stonewall Jackson. Jackson is probably the hero of everybody in Charleston. But
yes,
then I started thinking, there he is, Stonewall Jackson, one of my favorites. Now, what most people need to realize is that there are connections here that are just as strong as the others we've already demonstrated. Did you realize Hector's name means to hold?
I remember
Stonewall Jackson got his entire nickname from holding the front line and refusing to be moved by the enemy.
That's very interesting.
Coincidence? I think not. I call it mimesis.
That's very good. What else do we have about this Hector Stonewall
Hector
Jackson
was the hero of Troy, of course, and then Stonewall Jackson is no doubt the hero of the Confederacy. And Hector dedicated his homeland. And did you not know that he did the same thing? Stonewall Jackson, he dedicated to his homeland as well.
And they were both dedicated to their homelands, yes. What else?
Well, of course. I mean, Stonewall Jackson would have never entered the war. It was not over. He is a good Christian man. He did not want to take human life, but he felt like his homeland was under siege and he had to defend it. Now, obviously, the great warrior side of this, Troy's greatest warrior was Hector, and Lee's greatest general in the entire war was no doubt Stonewall Jackson.
See, this is what I thought was interesting, is that I thought Stonewall, I was like, obviously, you're going to try to say Hector is Robert E. Lee, and you're like, no, that's obviously Priam, because he's the real leader. And who's Priam's greatest warrior? It's Hector. Who is Lee's greatest general? Jackson.
Stonewall Jackson. That's exactly right. Now, some of my Calvinist friends here. Now, there's a lot of Calvinists here in the South, so we try to be careful with them. When you look at this, Stonewall Jackson was a strong Calvinist believer. He believed in divine appointments and sovereignty of God.
Well, before we get to that, you'd mentioned that in the Iliad, like Hector refuses that wine mixed with honey, and Stonewall Jackson, unlike Odysseus or Ulysses, tried to abstain from a lot of alcohol. And it's like, there's a little interesting parallel. Hector refuses that wine libation. Stonewall Jackson's not a big drinker. Very interesting connection there.
Yes, he was a good, strong Christian who refused to take from the wine bottle a little too much, I would say. He should have enjoyed himself a little bit, of course, but he didn't. But nonetheless, he was a strong Christian man. That's why we honor him in the South. We speak very highly of Stonewall, you see. But when you look at Stonewall Jackson, because of his religious beliefs, he was a Calvinist who believed in divine intervention and appointments. Now, it's interesting that Hector believed in the fates of the gods. He believed there was actual divine appointments from the gods. I don't find that a coincidence. Now, there was also, with Hector, he greatly feared by the Achaeans. And also, you know who the North feared? You bet. Stonewall
Stonewall
Jackson. He was
Yes, very
very much fearful. In fact, they kind of liked him a little bit. At least that's what we tell ourselves. But he was definitely a likable man, but they did fear him. He was a vicious leader for his men.
Interesting. So
Now,
then we also have defeated by Achilles.
Yeah, Hector was defeated by Achilles, and unfortunately, Stonewall was defeated at Antietam, and he died shortly after. I mean, he was in fact, the rumor is that he was shot by his own men, possibly friendly fire that put him into a state of sickness, and he died later from that. But nonetheless, he was defeated at Antietam, and yet Hector was defeated by Achilles, and both start with an A. I don't know if anybody knows that, but
Interesting. Yes.
yeah, it's once again mimesis, Michael. Mimesis.
Now this next one was interesting to me because you actually make a connection to Achilles to Antietam. What is that?
Oh, that's why I mentioned. No, they start with an A. Achilles was called swift-footed. He had quick feet, apparently. At the same time, Antietam means swift water.
That
anybody
one
in the
was
South
really
knows
interesting.
that. Everybody in the
That
South
one was-
knows that.
That was interesting that they just happened to be at a place. And we're going to get more into Antietam because there's some interesting things about this battle when we start talking about Achilles. So we'll come back to this. Keep Antietam in your mind, folks. There's definitely something here. But what else do we have about Hector and Stonewall Jackson?
So Hector dies prematurely before the war ends, as we just discussed. So did Stonewall Jackson. God bless him. His soul is with the Lord now. But I just looking at this, okay, they both died before the war, of course.
Yeah,
now, they both believed to be fated by the gods to die.
Yes, what you showed this very interesting is that shortly before Stonewall Jackson died in the legends, Lincoln had called for national prayer, and then sure enough, the greatest general of the South, Lee's strongest warrior, dies. Like, very interesting little connection there. It's like, and we see throughout the Iliad, Hector's fated to die. Very interesting little divine connection they're doing there.
Ah, yes, the fate of the gods. He was also, Hector, and his farewell to his wife and son is one of the most poignant moments in the Iliad, showcasing his humanity. Now, on the other hand, Stonewall Jackson, known for his deep love for his family and dedication, I may add, particularly his wife and young daughter, often expressing his desire to return to them. He wrote letter after letter, wanting to be with his family.
Interesting. Yeah, they're both family men. So they're both not big drinkers. They're both believe in this idea of fate. They're both big family men. Like, you just sort of see Hector coming through Stonewall Jackson. And again, the name, it's the same. The name meaning is there. So I mean, it's like it's right in your face.
And Hector was carried away in a wagon, as was Stonewall Jackson. He was also carried away in a wagon as well. And if you noticed, in Hector, they mourned for 9 days in Troy. There was 9 days from being shot to his death for Jackson.
Right. He was. Now, you guys got to include the day he was shot. You're not going to count 8 days. You got to actually include that he was shot on May 2nd. That's one. And then you add the 8 days to May 10th is when he died. Now, some might be like, well, that's different because they mourned for Troy for 9 days after he died. This is the 9 days from when he shot to when he had died. Guys, the 9-day motif is just there. It's not going to be the same. This is mimesis. This is imitation here. It's not going to be the same, but the 9-day motif is still there with this. So you see this little sort of transvaluation, little mimesis they're doing here.
It's simple math, if you ask me, Michael. But the last thing I want to point out here is that after his death, Troy's fate is sealed. So when Hector dies, the fate, it's sealed, it's finished. And the same thing was true for the South. Unfortunately, after his death, the South's fate seemingly was over at that point, and it did lead to the defeat of the South.
Interesting. Yes. So, all right, but we're going to get to Achilles here in a second because this is going to be the nail clincher here, right? This is going to be the very. But really quick, Silent Gaming says, "Whoa, my Christian faith has been shattered." Yes, because you realize mimesis is just everywhere. How much of history do we really know? There's so much mimesis at play. Is that correct in your view?
It's everywhere if you're looking for it, Michael, in a lot of places. In fact, I hope what this does is inspires your crowd to go out and to seek these connections. They're everywhere in history.
Yeah, interesting. So, what does the Battle of Picacho Peak fit in here? And I think it might be something actually in the Odyssey. We're not sure yet, because this happens far out west, and it could be paralleling something in the Odyssey instead of the Iliad. But we're not entirely sure. We're still working on that. There's a lot of very clever author tricks they're doing here that we just haven't fully figured out. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, no. I'm just ready to get into Achilles. I'll leave that to you.
Who's your favorite person from the Iliad? My favorite person is Diomedes, and the only better Greek is Plato. I also have a pet theory that Ajax the Greater is the blood related to Goliath from the Bible. I'm not sure about that last one. But I think my favorite I might have to agree with you. I think actually it's probably either going to be Odysseus or Diomedes. I think those are the two that go out on the spy mission in the Iliad.
Odysseus for me. I like Odysseus.
Yes. Inspiring sophistry. How dare you lie to your audience by denying a handful of tangential similarities between Greek myth and the Gospels? It's obvious. You see? Yes, absolutely. And that's what we're showing here. How obvious this mimesis is when you just take Dr. McDonald's criteria and you start applying it elsewhere, you just see all the mimesis showing up. It's just everywhere, ladies and gentlemen. It's
everywhere.
Yes. Lincoln was killed in Ford's Theater. John F. Kennedy was killed in Ford at an automobile. Yeah, could very well be some mimesis happening there with JFK and Lincoln. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, I think anybody should look at the assassination of both presidents. I think they'll find that their killers are also related. There's many more. There's a making of this. Good. Continue, John Davis. Continue on your quest. You will find more mimesis.
Please, doctor, stroke that mustache. Very good. Yes. Very authentic, totally not fake mustache. Very, very nice there. All right. So with that, let's get back into this. Are you guys ready to find out who Achilles is?
Yes. Achilles.
Yeah, so let's pull him up here. So this one I was a little confused about because I'm like, who could Achilles possibly be? But who is Achilles in this American Iliad?
Oh, General George McClellan, of course.
Yeah. Now this one I was like, come on. That can't be right. They don't even have the right name. How is Achilles related to the name George?
Well, that's where you're wrong, Michael. That's where you're wrong, of course. The Greek name, which means of Achilles, is pain of the people. Now, let me take you back in time. George comes from the Greek, and it means earth worker or a farmer. Now, that's supposed to take us back to the Bible, of course. Genesis chapter 3. Exactly.
Right.
Maybe
because
you
remember,
find that intriguing.
I found that intriguing because you're like, remember, this is the American Iliad. This is a Christian people. Yes, they're Christian. They're writing their own Iliad by imitating the older one. And what is pain of the people for a Christian people? It's right there in the Bible. Genesis 3, earthworking, farming. They're putting it right in our face. It's like, it's just so obvious that they're doing this. Like Achilles, George, the names are connected.
And obviously Achilles was known as a prideful and stubborn, very stubborn man. But let me just tell you, his pride and stubbornness was not a match for George McClellan. He was far more prideful and stubborn. In fact, Achilles, he idolized Greek hero. And again, I don't want to spend too much time getting into the details because I have more theories, but we're just trying to keep it a short program here.
Right.
But what did you think about this one here as it relates to McClellan when I told him about you the other day?
Yes, Achilles is an idealized Greek hero, but people don't realize this. McClellan is sort of known as like bad now, but during the time of this war, he was idealized by his men. They called themselves McClellan's men. In the early versions of this civil war that were put out by the North, like he's obviously idealized by a lot of people. In fact, when Lincoln had to run for re-election, who was his opponent? The Democrats put up George McClellan. That's how much he was liked at the time. They thought he could beat Lincoln.
And I just want to clarify, he was never liked in the South, especially here in Charleston. But yes, he was very much liked. In fact, we would say his followers were cultic, very cultic in their oppression of him. But did you realize that Achilles, on the other hand, was younger than Odysseus, the same way McClellan was younger than Ulysses S. Grant? And we don't need to relive that. We've already seen the parallels there.
Yeah. But what's interesting though is why on earth, if this is none of this is myth, why would you put such a young general in charge of the entire Northern Army when there was much more experienced generals out there? Well, he's got to be young because he's got to be like young Achilles. So of course you wouldn't do that if you weren't myth making. So obviously the odds of him being younger than both much more experienced generals, very unlikely. But if you're doing mimesis of Achilles, of course he's got to be young.
It's that simple, Michael. It's that simple. Now, did you know that Achilles is extremely, extremely protective of his men, especially Patrocius? Now, McClellan was actually very, very protective of his, and they of him, of course, as we've already described. They're very protective of each other, but McClellan was always looking after his men.
Right. Like he wouldn't even send them into battle throughout a lot of this. And this is one of the things that I was thinking about. How could Achilles, this legendary hero, be like George McClellan, who never went and fought, like very few times? You're like, you got to think about who Achilles is in the Iliad. He doesn't do anything until the end of the Iliad. He's just sort of hanging out in his tent, being protective of his men, not willing to go fight with the Achaeans. What is George McClellan doing from all his time in the Civil War? Nothing. He's up in the north, just being on defensive, not really doing a lot of attacking, that kind of stuff. Very similar there. So you got to think about who Achilles is in the Iliad, not who you think he is in like these movies like Troy or something.
Yes. And if you remember, as I stated, there was much, much arrogance in both these men. And by that arrogance, Achilles disputed with Agamemnon. In fact, this is actually what ends up happening quite a bit because McClellan is extremely the thorn in the flesh to Abraham Lincoln. Right. And in fact, Achilles disobeyed Agamemnon's direct orders, just as we see McClellan disobey Lincoln's direct orders. I mean, again, you cannot get away from the comparisons, Michael. They are there.
Right. Like, why on earth would this general put in charge of all these forces be disobeying the commander-in-chief? It's very unlikely a military man would do that. But if you want to make him like Achilles, these are the legends you have to put in there.
You have to do this. You have to look at the evidence. And that's why we have come to this conclusion. By the way, we are not done here.
No, there's a lot more here.
We're actually getting started. And the disputes and the disobedience, they led to the dishonoring. And so what ended up happening? Achilles dishonored Agamemnon just as McClellan dishonored twice. He was dishonored twice, not once, twice. By Lincoln.
Again, it's about making the greater Iliad. So Agamemnon dishonors Achilles once, but in the American Iliad, it happens twice. When he's dismissed as the leader of the Northern forces and when Lincoln beats him in the election. So he's dishonored twice. Dismissed once and then dismissed again because he doesn't get to win for president there. So very interesting.
Yes. And Achilles, he hated Hector. And wouldn't you know it, the counterpart of Hector was Stonewall Jackson. Right. General Jackson, right. Oh, well, guess who hated General Jackson? Well, it was General McClellan, of course. There was a hate on hate here. So again, you see each character not just come together with each other, but even their counterparts are equally hating each other. Again, this is either a coincidence or mimesis.
That's true. Yes, that's a very, very good point there. So what else do we have here?
Oh, goodness. Before the death, we see that Achilles refused to fight. I don't know if you remember that in the stories. He was not in the mood to fight. He did not want to fight. In fact, that's exactly what happened. When McClellan, he was extremely cautious approach until Antietam. He was very hesitant for a while. You see, he didn't want to go in. He was we call him a coward, of course, but he would say it was strategic.
Yes, yeah, and that's an important. Like if you want George McClellan to imitate Achilles in the Iliad, you have to have him holding back until a big major battle. And that's what McClellan does for the most part. There's like one invasion where he tries to get close to Richmond. They're trying to spice up the story a little bit. We get that. But really, he doesn't even have a victory until Antietam. And again, what do we see with Achilles in the Iliad? Doesn't go out and do much. In the Iliad, doesn't do anything until he's ready to avenge Patroclus.
Yes. Now, Troy, in Achilles' sense, is winning until Achilles returns to fight. The same thing happens. McClellan over here on the other side, the South was actually winning until McClellan stops their advance at Antietam, which continues into this, because when you look at this, Achilles, in the sense of his time, was the bloodiest day of the Iliad. The bloodiest day of the war. Guess who was the general in the bloodiest day of the Civil War? You see, it was under McClellan.
Yes, and this is apparently, according to the legends, the bloodiest day in American history. Are we really to believe this is bloodier than Pearl Harbor or 9/11? I mean, in the 1800s of all time, like when there was less people, it's just really fantastical. But again, if you got to make it like the day in the Iliad when he goes and he kills Hector, you got to make it very bloody. So that's what's going on.
Again, when we look at this and we talk about the rivers now, let's talk about some water sources. The water here. The rivers ran red with the blood of the bloodiest day. And as we continue to look at McClellan, guess what ran with blood? The Antietam Creek. It is described in full by historians. Antietam Creek ran with the blood of men.
Yes. And there's a very... when Achilles is going to kill Hector, he fights a river. Isn't it odd that this epic battle is named after a creek or a river? It's like they're trying to make these connections here.
Oh, yes. In fact, here's another one for you, Michael, if you're just listening. When you look at Achilles, Achilles was reckless. He charged straight into battle, extremely reckless. On the other hand, McClellan, he was actually very hesitant before he charged into battle. It's interesting in that regard. And then, if you look at this, Achilles, he defeats Hector. Now, we talked about Hector. I don't want to spend too much more time on him. On the other hand, McClellan defeats Stonewall Jackson. As we talked about, do you see the counterparts continually find their way to each other?
Yes, and people are like, but most of the fighting actually happened on Stonewall Jackson's side at Antietam. That's where a lot of the fighting was. That's where most of the death was happening. What are the odds? So, and again, what's really interesting is that like McClellan, this is this transvaluation here with him being hesitant and reckless because you're trying to make it more the American Iliad here. But what's interesting is on Antietam, that's the only time that McClellan moved with swiftness. He moved with swiftness to stop the South's advance. Just like Achilles, that one time, he's charging at Hector. So there's a very interesting connection there.
I thought so myself, Michael. Thank you for pointing that out to me. Now, this one I think you might find to be intriguing. As we look at this, when you look at our character, Achilles, it's called swift-footed Achilles. On the other hand, when you look at McClellan, who wins at Antietam, did you realize it means swift water?
Yeah, that's an interesting. And again, there's a big scene in the Iliad where Achilles has to fight a river. And what is this battle about? Named after? River or creek. Very odd connection since most battles were named after fields or towns. But this one's named after a river. So very interesting that they do that there.
Achilles, on the other hand, as well, to add, he gives Hector's body back to Priam. Whereas Stonewall Jackson, McClellan lets Stonewall Jackson and the Southern armies flee.
Right, yes.
Now, the last one I want to point out, just really quickly, if you don't mind, Michael. Achilles, on the other hand, he mourned after the killing of Hector. Whereas on our man here, McClellan, he mourned after being dismissed by Lincoln. There's some mournfulness going on between them. The parallels cannot be ignored. Mourn is
you know what I was thinking about this here is that what happens is like very odd that he would win this major battle and then Lincoln would just dismiss him. Now it's because he let the Southern Army leave. He didn't chase after him. That's according to the stories. But you know what I think is more interesting is like the Iliad ends and we don't hear any more of Achilles. And what does the Odyssey pick up with? The main character of Odysseus. What happens right after Antietam? The siege of Vicksburg. Who is the hero? Odysseus. It's like they're ending the Iliad with George McClellan. He did his major battle. He's dismissed. He's gone. And they're picking up now with Odysseus. Sort of like you have this interesting sequence going from the Iliad, ending with that major battle at Swift Water or Swift Footed. And then you pick right up with the new hero, Odysseus. You get the idea.
Yes, very much.
So you also have talked about other research. You actually used an artificial intelligence system to actually try to find more parallels. And interestingly enough, you came up with more. The artificial intelligence was confirming there are parallels here.
I would like you to describe these because I'm a little bit trying to stay humble here because one of the amazing things is that technology is actually teaching us, Michael, that this has been right all along.
Right. It's when you put it into the AI, it said they both have an epic scope. Conflicts between factions in the Iliad, the Greeks and the Trojans clash over honor, vengeance. In Helen, the Union and the Confederacy fight over issues as well. And I think Helen is just mimesis into America as like Lady Liberty, that kind of stuff going on here. But there's central role of historical figures here. Like, again, we've talked about these mythical figures, larger than life figures. Stonewall Jackson, Ulysses S. Grant. You have again, Agamemnon. And it's just, that's just like, how do you know any of the generals from Desert Storm or Vietnam War? No, because that's just not the way they're fought. But for some reason, we know these larger than life figures in these kind of epic wars here, because again, you have to have these epic heroic figures there. Okay. Themes of honor and sacrifice. Again, the AI was picking up that as well. Also picking up tragic consequences of the war in the Iliad. Scenes like Hector's death and Priam's mourning his son underscore the personal tragedies. Meanwhile, in the Civil War, the massive loss of life and the devastation of the South reflected profound societal and personal costs. It also pointed out that in the Iliad, the gods intervene, constantly symbolizing fate. And in the Civil War, religious and moral rhetoric throughout these speeches, religion is constantly intervening in the Civil War. Again, we don't hear that when we talk about modern wars for some reason, but in this one, there's constant of this intervention of these religious themes here. And again, cultural legacy and myth making. This way, the AI picked this up. I was really thrown away by this. I was like, the Iliad, it says it became a foundation of epic for Greek culture. Meanwhile, the Civil War inspired literature, art, and memory culture, shaping American identity. And finally, I think this is the last one here. Yes. Focused on individuals amid mass conflict. We see this both in the Iliad with personal speeches, personal duels, and in the Civil War, personal letters and diaries. Very interesting that you start to see these connections when you look at the Civil War.
All I have to say, Michael, is that even technology knows the truth.
That's true. It's very true. And again, guys, we're not saying the Civil War is total myth. We're saying there's legends of myth here. The North wanted a propaganda piece. We think the federal government made up this mimesis story, put out all of the different media factions to start spreading this idea around. And that's why we have all these different sources saying this kind of stuff. This is what the government does. We saw it with Facebook recently, with them telling them to spread certain stories and highlight certain things. They've been doing this for decades. They've been doing this all the way back to the 1800s, and that's what they did here. They wanted to put out this propaganda piece, and so there's clearly a war under there. But they changed things. They imitated Homer to make it more epic than it actually was, and it's very clear when you look at it, ladies and gentlemen.
And that's what we believe here in the South, that they are trying to suppress us for a second time.
Yes. So there's other important things about this. So one of Dr. McDonald's criteria is, look, in the ancient world, when you look at the Gospels, other people were imitating Homer. Well, you've done your research here, sir. You have found that modern writers have been imitating Homer for centuries.
Yes, yes. I'd like to read those.
Here. Yes, go for it. Yes. So this isn't something just with the Civil War, ladies and gentlemen. Everyone in the 17, 18, 1900s is imitating Homer. Why can't the Civil War just also be imitating Homer?
Ah, yes, yes. There's a play called The Dismissal of the Greek Envoys. Now, by the way, this is in the 16th century.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, we must continue. The Adventures of Telemachus, the son of Ulysses. This is 17th century. There was a play, The Destruction of Troy, also around the same time, 1678. There was also the Troilus and the Cressida, the Dryden play in 1679, which, by the way, is a reworking of William Shakespeare's 1602. Now, this is set during the, guess when, Michael? The Trojan Wars, of course, of course. Why don't you continue the list here, Michael? It's quite fascinating. I find this intriguing, and I think you'd be foolish to ignore it.
Yes, I mean, you have the Battle of Frogs and Mice, with just before the Civil War, just a few decades, it parodies the Iliad. You have an opera in the 1900s. It's about a Zeppelin captain named Ulysses. So there you go again. Why can't Ulysses S. Grant also be an imitation, just like this opera was doing? You have The World's Desire in 1890, a novel about Odysseus and Helen of Troy. You have collections of poems called The Triumph of Achilles. Again, more mimesis happening there. You have a novel by James Joyce called Ulysses, which takes place in Dublin. And my personal favorite, there was a movie that came out about this on this novel. The novel is Cold Mountain. It's a Civil War story that is based off the Odyssey. It's like he knows there's something there, and he can use it to make his own imitation of the Odyssey. And it's very interesting. It's about a guy at war who wants to go home, so he goes on his own Odyssey to get back home in the South. So you could see it right there. They're aware of the Civil War and the Odyssey. There's some interesting connections there, and this author was able to play on these connections to make that. I found that very fascinating.
It's a great movie, Michael. Anybody should watch it. It's a little naughty at times, but it is a good movie.
Yeah. I mean, there's also more here I want to talk about. So people are like, yeah, but this is just a regular event. Actually, there's a lot of miracles in the Civil War.
Many.
Yes. Like Abraham Lincoln issued proclamation of prayer. And then shortly after, Stonewall Jackson died, which many attributed to that. There's a guy named William Federer who's written books recently, and he's arguing that, yes, that was the cause here. After the Battle of Shiloh, wounded soldiers' injuries were glowing faintly in the dark, according to reports. They saw this as a miraculous sign, and those soldiers had a higher survival rate. Yeah, I looked up a little bit after you told me this, sir, and they said this may be from some sort of like luminescent bacteria. And I'm like, guys, it's just a story. Stop trying to rationalize it. We don't need to harmonize this stuff. It's clearly meant to be miraculous. So President Lincoln also reported he had a dream of his own death shortly before the assassination. What are the odds of that happening? Yeah. So George Washington allegedly foretold of this. Very unlikely as well.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, there are these crazy reports of this silent tree that stood at the Battle of Fredericksburg. And apparently it was a symbol of survival, and people could hide behind it and survive all these bullet shots. Very unlikely. And then my favorite is that Civil War soldiers allegedly were talking about these figures that had green eyes amongst the dead troops on the battlefield.
Ah, yes.
You know what's very interesting is in the Iliad, the gods are always moving on the battlefield. Aphrodite comes in, Athena comes in. What do we have in the American Iliad? These weird supernatural figures in the battlefield showing up as well. A very interesting connection there is what I think.
I couldn't agree more. I wrote it up, and it seems like I don't need to convince you anymore, Michael. It seems like you're 100% behind my you are behind my class.
Very good here. Yes. And, there's these weird, unlikely things that also happened during the Civil War. So Robert E. Lee, who's I think mimesis of Priam, managed to outsmart every Northern general. But for some reason, he just makes a horrible mistake at Gettysburg with Pickett's division sent to attack the center. Even James Longstreet knew that was a dumb idea. How did someone who's supposed to be so smart make such a dumb decision?
Yes.
Yeah. And if Ulysses S. Grant was really this genius general, why was he not in charge at the beginning? Why did the younger McClellan get put in charge? It just seems very unlikely that would happen.
Who was stubborn and disobedient to his to his own president, for goodness sakes. Bring Grant in earlier, right? No, there's an agenda.
Right. And there are 5 known manuscript copies of Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Did he even give that? Come on. Did he give all 5 of them?
I think not.
Lincoln supposedly had to disguise himself when he traveled to Washington. Okay, so the president, when he was elected, is traveling by train, and he's got to disguise himself. How is a man who is 6'4" going to disguise himself on a train? Like, come on. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, I am against disguising oneself, Michael. I think disguise is unnecessary.
Right. Now, also, the way they sort of make him is this mythical, virtuous giant who freed the slaves. I mean, like, yeah, we get it. He's a Paul Bunyan. Okay, we get it, what's going on here. But also, this is a very interesting aspect of the Civil War. The first battle, the Battle of Bull Run, was allegedly in Wilmer McLean's front yard near Manassas, Virginia. And then it ended in Wilmer McLean's house much further away in Virginia. But it's 150 miles apart. What are the odds of that? Are we there? You'll see historians trying to rationalize it. Well, he moved. Guys, it's just a story. It's got to end where it started. That's what they're trying to say here. Okay, just let it be a story. You don't have to rationalize it or try to harmonize this stuff. But that's what a lot of these Civil War apologists end up doing. It's very, very unfortunate.
Very.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And there's also contradictions, as we mentioned, the 5 known manuscripts of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. You just ask them simple questions. Who fired the first shots at Fort Sumter? Was it
right in my backyard?
Yes. Union or Confederacy? It depends on which manuscript you read. What was the war fought over? Slavery or states' rights? It depends on what manuscript you read. Did the Union strategically retreat to Cemetery Hill at the Battle of Gettysburg, or did they fall back to escape a Confederate advance? It depends on which manuscript you read. Were over 23,000 dead and wounded at Antietam, or under 23,000? It depends on what manuscript you read. What were Stonewall Jackson's last words? Depends on what manuscript you read. What was discussed at the meeting between Lee and Grant? It depends on what manuscript you read.
I agree.
Very, very interesting here. So, with all that said and done, ladies and gentlemen, let's go back through Dennis McDonald's criteria. Was Homer accessible to the authors in the 1800s? These federal agents who were putting out this propaganda.
Absolutely. We just showed that he was known for many, many years around the same time by others, and plays and songs. All of this was made. They had access to these texts.
And on that note, did other authors imitate Homer around this time? Absolutely. We showed you.
Just showed it.
Are there a lot of parallels? We've got so many parallels. There's so many more we're even coming up with, like with Menelaus, for example. It's like you can keep finding them. Are the sequence of events relatively similar? Yes, because you have the main character being George McClellan, a.k.a. Achilles, until Antietam. Then after that, the main character is Odysseus of the Odyssey. You see the order that's sort of following. Very similar order of a lot of things. And distinctive traits. Yes, very distinctive traits. Names, specific things, like the 9-day motif is there with Hector.
Yes.
You see that kind of thing. Is anything gained by the imitation? Yes, the North is showing their Odysseus, their Agamemnon, they're superior to the ones in Homer. So you can see there's something gained by this imitation.
Yes.
Yeah. And did other authors around the same time show awareness between Homer? Yes. I have one more article that you said, ask me to find this for you. And
did you find that for me, Michael? Yes. Thank you for finding that.
Yes, I will read a little bit here. So notice what he sort of says here. It's very interesting. So he says, talking about, again, the American Iliad. You can see it right there. Okay. I lost my place here. There it goes. Okay. It was merely a clever title. Now, again, they're not going as far as you do with the mimesis thing, but they're recognizing there's something here. Okay. He goes, in Homer's Iliad, the anger of Achilles, perfidy of Agamemnon, the doom, gallantry of Hector, and the relationship between them have enormous, uncontested, unchanging, and almost primal symbolic meaning. So too do certain figures of the American Iliad. Interesting. Prominent among are the butcher Grant, the Christ-like Lee, the rage-filled Sherman. I believe that the traditional Civil War narratives function as a national myth of the central importance to our understanding of ourselves and the Americans. And then he goes on here. He talks a little bit about Abraham Lincoln and George McClellan and how they're rivals, just like Agamemnon and Achilles. See what they're doing here, ladies and gentlemen? Other authors recognize these similarities. They're just not going so far as to say mimesis. But you just got to look at the parallel. It's just right there in your face. I mean, it's just so obvious.
It's right there in front of people's faces, Michael. I don't understand why people continue to ignore this.
Yes, and as I was talking with you earlier, Mike Lacona has actually been going through various aspects of Plutarch's lives, and is finding mimesis there. He's finding mimesis with people like Pompey that may just be imitating Hector, and he's very curious that some of the other figures might also just be imitating uh, characters from the Iliad as well. So it's everywhere. In the document we're going to put down below that Dr. McDennis has been working on, he's going to show that Martin Luther also might be imitating Homer. Yeah, but Napoleon might be imitating Julius Caesar. We've got all these incredible examples of this happening throughout history. So we're just asking for consistency here, ladies and gentlemen. If Dr. McDonald wants to say the Gospels are, he should just take that criteria and start applying it elsewhere, like Dr. McDennis has done.
Like I said, he is a brilliant man, Michael, but too smart for himself sometimes. I think he underscored himself. He actually should have taken this a little bit further.
Yes. There's so much of history. It seems to be doing this mimesis stuff here. And so let me put up that document. We'll share this below. But I mean, you can just go here and see, look, you've also found all these parallels here between Odysseus and Martin Luther. And these were very interesting as well. And so this is another interesting case you're building. And then you said that other people just aren't even doing Homer, like Napoleon Bonaparte might be doing some sort of imitation on this Julius Caesar figure. So there's just all these various imitations happening.
It's everywhere. As I said, I would encourage your audience. In Charleston, we like to think deeply about things. And I would encourage your audience to take these documents and to build on them, actually create their own. It's fun. It's fun to do this.
Yeah, this is an earlier document you had going on here where you started out with Abraham Lincoln and Agamemnon, and you found all sorts of interesting things here we didn't even have time to get to because there's just so much happening here.
Quite a bit, I would say, actually.
That's interesting. This is all the work you've been sort of going through and showing all these parallels here. It's just fascinating. It's very fascinating. Yes. So we'll link that below. We don't have time to get to all of that today because again, there's just so much. And when we take Dr. McDonald's criteria and we start applying it elsewhere, everything seems to be imitating Homer. How much of history is real? Is it more likely that given the vast amount of stories out there, there's just going to be coincidences between the made-up ones and the real ones that happen in history? Or is everyone just doing mimesis?
Oh, I think mimesis is being undersold in history. I think what's happening is that we are waking up to this reality, and MacDonald has given us insight to think differently. Now, I will say, I do believe there is truth in many of these stories. In fact, I would say that these stories should be read, but read with a different lens.
I like what you did there, sir. Yeah, there's a lot of very interesting stuff here you've come up with in terms of finding all this mimesis. And again, it's just taking McDonald's criteria, Dr. McDonald's criteria, how he's applied it to the Gospels, and then applying it to things like the Civil War, Martin Luther, even like people like Napoleon Bonaparte. You just take his criteria, you're going to find it everywhere. And when we do that, we got to start really questioning a lot of this history. Like, because we cannot have double standards. We just can't apply it to one area of history. We got to apply it to other areas. And if it checks out, it's more likely, I guess, mimesis is happening there, and not that coincidences happen or that the criteria is wrong or anything like that.
Right. That's very, very well said, Michael. Very well said.
Interesting. All right, let's get to some of your super chats here. Does Justin Martyr make comparisons between Jesus and Hercules in his first apology? Doesn't that give the mimicists and Hume historical credibility? I'll have a video on that probably, I think, later this year on that specific thing. He does make comparisons, but he's also talking mostly about persecution. He's saying like, hey, like, don't persecute us. Just look at us the way you look at people who worship Hercules, don't kill us. That's kind of what he's getting at. So I'll go over some of that in the future. I think every written work post Homer just plagiarized him. Is that your take?
I would say no many years ago, but I would not dismiss it at this point.
Yeah. So Derek crying in the corner right now. I don't see why. I mean, we're just taking the criteria that Dr. McDonald has laid out for us and just seeing how it works in other places of history. I don't see why he'd be upset by that. He should be happy that it's being applied.
I'm on his side. I'm trying to help the man show his brilliance.
Yes. Show how everyone is just making these myths and imitating Homer and taking historical things and just working them up into these big historical fictions. And again, we're not saying the Civil War didn't happen. What we're saying is that the federal government put out the story to different media outlets, start spreading it around to make the Civil War into something much grander to keep the South down. That's Dr. McDennis's theory here. Well, it's hard to argue with this. Checkmate historians. That's the point we're getting at. Why haven't historians looked more at this mimesis stuff for the Civil War?
Listen, I'm not in this for accolades and money. I'm simply in this for the truth.
Exactly. And given all these parallels, it seems like mimesis is undeniable at this point when it comes to the Civil War. Yes, absolutely. Do you think there might be some mimesis happening with this World War II? You have two fronts. You have the European front, where a bunch of forces invade from the West, like the Iliad. Then you have the Pacific front with an island hopping campaign, like the Odyssey.
Michael, when we were having coffee the other day, I thought that was a little absurd. But the more you were talking about it, I said to myself, Michael might be right. So the more we talked about, by the way, thank you for buying coffee from me the other day. When we were having the conversation, I looked over and I said, that might be something worth studying. So I challenge anybody to take the study.
Yeah, there's already a George. There's General George Patton on the Iliad front who could be Achilles. So you already have another George there, which is that we are already established is connected to the name Achilles.
It's right there in front of you.
Yes. It's worth pointing out that we're not saying McDonald's position doesn't exist. We're just saying its similarities to this stream are interesting. Yeah, I see what you did there. Very interesting there. Are pantheon gods demons? Depends. Michael Heiser, I think, said yes. A lot of other scholars would say no. But I mean, it doesn't really matter in terms of the long run. When are you going to bring extraordinary evidence on your channel? He's super underrated. I'll take a look at him. I've not heard him before. This is my first time hearing of him, so I'll take a look. Inspiring rationality says mind blown. Exactly, sir. Exactly. And I'm glad you're getting this. I'm glad you're seeing what's going on here. You see, the Civil War apologists have been destroyed. This is the proof. You're right, Nathan. That's absolutely true. They're going to try to rationalize this, explain this kind of stuff away.
Yes.
They're going to use a lot of the same techniques I used in that video I posted Friday to dismiss this stuff. But I mean, we just got to ask, listen, if this is what the Gospels are doing, this is also what the creators in the federal government are doing for the Civil War. Like when they're putting out this story, it's just a similar thing. You can't have one without the other is our take. Is that your take, Dr. McDennis?
That is my take.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Fisherman's Corner, for gifting another 50 Inspiring Philosophy memberships. So much appreciated for that. And also, what if I'm similar to Odysseus? Am I a myth? What would your take be on that? If there are similarities between his life and Odysseus, would that mean a lot of what happened is a myth?
Historians in the future may look at your life and see what you accomplish, and you never know.
Never know, ladies and gentlemen. Keep that kind of stuff in mind when we're looking at this stuff. So, again, we'll link the document below and let everyone see this kind of stuff that Dr. McDennis has been working on. All this mimesis, he's been taking Dr. McDonald's criteria and just applying it all throughout history and finding some amazing parallels using Dr. McDonald's own criteria. And I just was so fascinated. I had to bring him on. Anything else you want to say before we close this out?
No, Michael, you've been very generous in your time and your questions. And thank you for sharing my study with everyone.
Well, before we go, I want to play an important clip from the great Dr. McDonald here. I think this is important because there's an important aspect of your methodology, sir, that cannot be overlooked. So let's just play this clip here when he's responding to these apologists here. And I think this is just an important point that needs to be brought up.
Paul was being escorted as a prisoner to a place where he hadn't been before, whereas Odysseus was returning home after a successful campaign. Odysseus survives the shipwreck naked and alone, whereas Paul...
I'd like, can you answer that? Why Paul, Paul and everybody survives, but only Odysseus survives in the shipwreck here?
Well, it's a transform to say that Paul's God is going to save not just him but 270 other passengers. So it's a transform, and these people are so unimaginative. It seems to me.
See, that's what I wanted to hit there. That's what a lot of your critics and Dr. McDonald's critics don't get, is that this stuff only works if you employ this part of your methodology. You got to use your imagination, folks.
That's
you can't
right,
be
Michael.
unimaginative.
Yes. Imagination. Use it.
This is all about using your imagination, folks, to find these parallels. That's what's important here. This only works in the imagination. And that's the problem with a lot of these critics of mimesis, is they're just not using their imagination. And when you realize that's a very important part of your methodology, it all just comes together. All the parallels just start making sense.
That's right. That is right.
Yes. And that other thing, one last question I want to ask you on that whole thing about transvaluation when they're transform things. It's like anything can really be a parallel. It's almost like it's unfalsifiable, which I think means it must be true. Is that what that means?
That's basically what's being said.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
totally
I would agree.
You would agree that all of this is just so unfalsifiable because anything can be transformed to be a parallel.
Yes, it's in the word transform.
That's it. And so, yeah, at the end of the day, this is just unfalsifiable, folks, which means it must be true, I guess. So thanks for coming, everyone, for this very important stream. We've been looking to bring you for a few days now on all these amazing parallels between the Civil War and Homer. And at the end of the day, I mean, like there's so much more we could get into. We get into Martin Luther, we get into Napoleon. You've been doing a lot of interesting work finding these parallels and just showing a lot of what we think of history is maybe more mimesis.
More mimesis, the better.
That's true. Interesting. So thank you for coming, everyone. I'll be back at my channel Monday at 8 Eastern Standard Time. I'll be interviewing Dr. Robert Bowman Jr. We're going to be responding to some videos and some objections that the New Testament doesn't teach the Trinity. So with that, I will close this out, and I will see you guys next time.